All right, good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Um, let's see, let's get our database up and running. That should fix the problem we're having right now. Um, there we go. So everything seems to be up and running. Um, well, TBD gamer, I'm going to apologize right away. I actually got pretty sick this week. Just getting over it. So last Sunday, when we had the birthday party for my daughter, my in-laws came as part of that, and they decided to bring influenza A with them, which basically took down my whole family for the whole week. Um, so last night it was pretty touch and go, but I decided I'd give it a shot today to do a little bit of streaming. Hey, Ole. So you guys could probably hear it in my voice. If it becomes too difficult, if I speak too much, it causes my coughing to happen more. If it becomes too difficult, I may have to end the stream. I'm hoping I can make it through, an hour, maybe 2 hours. Um, Hopefully a full stream today, but we'll see what happens. I will tell you guys, last night was the first night where I got when I woke up this morning, I got just shy of 7 hours of sleep. So that's pretty good for this week. I've been sleeping about 4 to 5 hours before I was waking up. Um, and so last night was the most sleep I've gotten in a while. And then I've been sleeping most of the day. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah, other than that, I'm doing well. I don't know. I'm just looking forward to doing something besides laying around and watching YouTube. And um, I've been watching I've been watching anime quite a bit. Um, and let's see, my daughter and I we've been watching Jack of All Trades, Party of None. That one's pretty good. Um, and um, then one of my favorites that I've started rewatching because I've got so much time is it wrong to pick up girls in a dungeon? Um, it I don't know. It's like it's like Sword Art if Sword Art didn't go into a weird arc, um, and it's a weird, funny anime that I enjoy. But anyway, these it looks like everything's working. This morning we upgraded to Angular 20. So we're gonna shut down our serve for right now. But we were able to get everything up and going. Um, we updated our we updated our Angular skills this morning. Um, so we're gonna stage all of this. Um, and updated Angular skills files. Um, so this is the weird thing about Angular skills and stuff like that is you've got to keep them up to date. Um, I guess it's not weird, right? Like everything has that issue. Um, the thing about the skills files is they're not stored in your npm lock, and so you do need to keep them up to date and run the commands that will update your skills every so often. Um, it's just part of the reality of I think as an industry we're still trying to figure out how to best handle skills files, how to best handle AI, how to best handle LLMs, it's still pretty much an emerging frontier. I mean, there are people who have really amazing skills in this area, but in general, the AI is still very emerging, still very new. And so there is still a lot of stuff that needs to be figured out. And so things wind up being very manual. And that's fine. I mean, that's just, I apologize about the coughing. Um, but anyway, let's take a look at a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. The first one was brought to my attention by Michael, and let me put this in the chat for everybody. So it was a security vulnerability raised in Angular, and back when React had the server side code execution, everybody made a huge deal out of it, right? Well, now it's Angular's turn, and this is like the issue here is when you start running code server side, you can introduce vulnerabilities into your application that can be a bit more significant, right? And so the Angular blog wrote up a nice write-up about it, where the two patched, so SSR vulnerabilities that they were made aware of. I don't think I'm doing well. The last two applications we did, and maybe this one is doing SSR. We can take a look really quickly. One way we can figure out if we're doing SSR is if we just do an ls here, and we go into our packages. Oh yeah, no slash. So here, if we go into our Angular dynos, and if we look, so we've got an ESLint project, a proxy, tsconfig. I think it's going to be in our source directory. So we've got a main.ts, and did I install bat? No, I didn't. That's too bad. So our main.ts would be what would show us. Let's pull up anti-gravity instead. This is probably the right way to go about this anyway. So inside of our main.ts, and so we've got an app config. Let's go take a look at our app config. Actually, I know this isn't, we don't have SSR enabled for this one. And the reason I know we don't have SSR enabled here is if we take a look at our files, we've got a main.ts. We don't have a server set up here. So we aren't using SSR in this project. However, in our Signal Store project, we were using SSR. So that is one thing to be aware of. We aren't using so ////, right? Yep, that's the one we want. Okay. So let's get back to, oh, that's not my browser. So the two patch vulnerabilities are an SSRF and header injection in Angular SSR. And then there's an open redirect via X-forward prefix in Angular SSR. So both of these affect anything that's using SSR. And so they're saying everybody should update their SSR applications. So these are pretty big. So SSRF stands for server-side request forgery. And if you want to learn more about that, they've got a link here that takes you to Mozilla, the MDN basically website. The MDN website gives you very good information on SSRF. But basically what SSRF is it allows you to, so when you're making requests to a server, so there's CSRF and there's SSRF. CSRF is basically things like forging cookies or forging tokens so that it looks like you're using these requests are legitimate requests. SSRF is a bit more significant because it allows you to bypass having to do, capture tokens or things like that. And maybe you can, right? But it happens on the server instead of in the browser or the client. And it's they're more significant because there are pieces in place that might, for example, prevent you from accessing the admin site. But with an SSRF vulnerability, then you could access the admin site, if you properly constructed something, right? And it's telling us that Angular's internal URL reconstruction logic incorrectly trusted user-controlled HTTP headers. And this is a mistake that's made everywhere. So I'm not going to blame like the Angular team for this. Everybody makes mistakes. But basically, when you're operating in a highly secure environment, and you go into what's known as zero trust, and zero trust is it's a standard, it's an industry standard that basically talks about things called PIPs, which are policy enforcement points, or policy, PEPs, PEPs, right, or policy enforcement points. PIP PIPs are how you determine where those points are. And so in zero trust, you can't trust anything. So, one common mistake that a lot of developers make and engineers make is they assume that because the browser doesn't allow certain things to happen, that they can trust data from the browser that makes it to the server. Or let's go here. And let's get a new canvas, right? So we'll make our client blue, right? And then we'll make our server white, right? And let's call this our API layer, because we're going to extend a little bit on this, right? And so, as the client makes requests to the API, it's going to send things like cookies. Let's not do it this way. Let's add an actual, add a text block here, right? So these are going to be like our cookies, our headers, um, our form data, stuff like that, right? These all come from the client, and these clients can be various different clients. These could be mobile clients. These could be browser clients. These could be anything like this, right? Um, a lot of mistakes that developers make is they assume that because we sent the cookies we get back um, are okay, right? And a lot of times we'll go, that was weird. Why did it do that? Let's make that there. We'll make that there. So again, we follow best practices with our cookies and everything, right? So our cookies are marked as HTTP only, right? And our headers, we send security headers. We're doing all the best practices, and so the issue comes in that we get these cookies back and we just implicitly trust them, or we get headers back and we implicitly trust them, or form data and we implicitly trust them. And this is kind of what Angular's talking about, right? Is that they were getting headers from the client that they were implicitly trusting. The problem with this is that it makes assumptions about the client, right? And in in a good world, this client is, let's go here, and this client is, oh, come on, I forget what it is. Oh, it's this. Let's just add a heart emoji here, right? Or no, this is what we'll add, right? This is our good client, right? Our sunshine and um, our sunshine and unicorns, right? And rainbows, right? Like everything happy. This client is the happy past client, right? Great. We can trust everything from this client. But what a lot of people don't recognize is I could write my own client, right? And this client is a little demon, right? It's evil, right? It doesn't behave the way you would expect it to, right? This client is not a good client, and it's going to get the same stuff, right? So the API is going to send stuff to this client, and it's going to send it in good faith, right? The same cookies, the same headers, but this client, and you can download Black Hat browsers or anything like that. This client doesn't have to follow the same rules that like Chrome or Firefox or Safari follows, right? And there are ways to do this too. So back in my early days of being a developer, I used to write web crawlers. And web crawlers are basically custom clients that you create to interface with APIs or websites or things like that. And I would manipulate cookies and headers and form data all the time in my clients. So stuff that couldn't happen in a browser, the APIs or the site would make assumptions about, and I could manipulate that in such a way that they thought that I was being a good, I was following the route that they wanted me to follow, but I was skipping steps, right? And this is important because it's not that difficult for people to create clients that are bad actors, right? And you may get, is it Shift that allows? No, is it Alt that allows? Yeah, it is. There we go. So you may have like a capability API layer hidden behind like a BFF or an experience API layer, right? And this is where something like Zero Trust comes into play, because you have a couple of different policy enforcement points, right? If we take this and we talk about policy enforcement points, we'll make them orange or brown or whatever that color is. I'm a dude. I don't see colors the same way. But these are our policy enforcement points. So we have a couple of places where we can enforce data. And this may exist inside of your BFF. This may exist at like a WAF or at an application gateway or something like that, right? So there may be a policy enforcement point here, but we also have policy enforcement points here, right? And this is the idea of Zero Trust. It's very, very similar to like high security installations, right? If you go to like a government building that's a high security building, there will be the initial entry, right? Very, very similar to like airports in the US. If you guys have ever been to airports in the US, there's this high security area to get into, right? And when you go through that high security area, there are a couple of different lines, right? If you're the lowest trust passenger in that line, they're going to make you go through the millimeter wave scanner. They're going to make you take off your belt. They're going to make you take off your shoes. You got to take off your hat. You got it right. Like, it's a bad experience when you're in the lowest line. You're doing everything, and they're treating you as with the least amount of trust, right? If you do something like TSA pre-approved or global entry in the US, then you can bypass a lot of those steps because you've pre-authorized. This is very similar to the way it works in the web, right? Like there may be people who have special keys that allow them to bypass certain pieces of your policy enforcement point because they're signing they're signing things a certain way. But just because you make it through the screening area, and everybody has to go through the screening area, right? The pilots, the TSA workers, the fast food workers, the janitors, everybody goes through the TSA screening in the US. It's the same way here, right? Everybody goes through this initial screening. Now, if you want to go somewhere more secure, you have to provide credentials that allow you to access somewhere more secure, right? So if you're an employee of the airport, there will be doors where you have to provide identification, and that gives you access to that area. Again, another policy enforcement point. So, everybody can get past here maybe, but to get into the more secure area, now you've got to provide better credentials. And the thing is, your credentials are checked at every one of these boundaries, right? It's the same way with Zero Trust. Very, very similar to the way we layer security in physical security, we layer the security in Zero Trust. So we check people's credentials here. Here, we don't just trust that, hey, these cookies and everything are good, even though we checked them here. There may be a way for them to bypass this, right? Maybe through internal channels or who knows what. So again, we validate, right? And then when this communicates with our capability layer, again, we validate and we validate. This is the idea of Zero Trust. And And it's a very important piece to understand when we're talking about web and web security. Because the thing is, like 98%, I don't know, 99.99% of people are going to use a browser or a mobile or, a trusted client, and it's all going to be sunshine and unicorns and everything's amazing, right? And so a lot of this feels like overkill and extra spend. But it only takes a small percentage of people to do something malicious, and suddenly your trust is completely eroded. And now we're talking about, what is the cost of this, right? So in the application that we're building, right, like this full stack Dynos application, it's hosted entirely locally. It's just a simple tutorial and things like that. Building in zero trust is probably not that big of a deal, right? But let's say you are like a big bank, right? Like Bank of America or somebody like that. Suddenly, the cost of this is huge, right? If I could pretend to be, Elon Musk and suddenly steal billions of dollars, right? Just as a bad example, you know, that's huge. And that's going to destroy the reputation of the company that I bypassed and I stole billions of dollars for, right? So my question then becomes, right, in this case, what do we do? And these are the things that, until you're exposed to them, most developers don't think about this kind of stuff, and that's perfectly fine. And the way I explain this to like senior management and things like that is they're like, well, why didn't they think about this? This seems obvious. Well, it seems obvious when you talk about it, right? Most things that seem obvious weren't obvious to you until somebody told you about it. It's the same way with developers and things like that. As a developer, we often talk about the swamp of perfection. And if you get stuck in the swamp of perfection, nothing gets done. And this goes into like my discussion about like good testers versus good engineers. Good engineers will never be good testers. Good testers will never be good engineers. And that's a generalization. But my reasoning for that is the same as my reasoning for this. It's that as an engineer, if you ever want to get anything done, you have to think happy path. You have to assume this will work. If you don't assume that, you're going to sabotage yourself, and things won't get done. And so if you haven't been exposed to this kind of thinking and the need for this kind of security and layering of security, you're not going to think about it. And I'm not saying that that's what happened with Angular. Angular probably, Google is a high security place, but it's easy to forget things, right? We make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Even LLMs make mistakes, right? So the thing is, software is never going to be perfect, and so what we do and how we handle it is really what matters. So in this case, right, Angular said they're implicitly trusting the headers. That's what happened, right? Angular's internal URL reconstruction logic incorrectly trusted user-controlled HTTP headers, right? And that's important. That's the important piece, right? Because somebody malicious could cause, specifically the host and the X-forward family determined the application's base origin without any validation of the destination domain. So basically you were able to say, you were able to pass in that, the X forwarded is basically this was forwarded from some place, and the host is basically saying this is the host that we're looking at. And Angular just trusted that without validating where they came from or where they're going to. And that goes back to here, right? If I'm a bad actor, I have access to the headers. You send me back some headers. I send you a header that says, "Oh no, I'm in the admin domain, and I came from the admin domain." And Angular's like, "Oh yeah, that's right." Even though I didn't, and I'm trying to go someplace I shouldn't be, Angular's like, "Oh yeah, we trust you. Yeah, you're a little trustworthy, right?" Kind of a form of social engineering. If you call somebody up and you're like, "Hey, I need to come look at your servers. I'll be there at blah, blah, blah time." And they're like, "Oh, yeah, you sound legit. Yeah, we're going to let you look at your servers," right? That's kind of what this is like in the physical world. So they fixed it, which that's the important piece, right? The error itself happens. It's just a mistake that happens. And, the discussion that we had before is not to say, that people should know what we're talking about. Like, even after the discussion we have now, I don't expect you guys to go to work, right, and be like, we need to implement zero trust and we need to do. You need to make that decision for yourself again, right? Going back to, if you're a bank, you should probably be doing zero trust. If you're a silly demo website like the Angular Dynos, zero trust is overkill. It's way too much spend for what you're doing. And so that's where, maybe you bring this up and you talk about it. Exactly, TBD Gamer. There's so much to take in, and there's so many trade-offs. And that's where becoming a good, like, senior level engineer, developer, architect, whatever, right? Becoming a good one of those is recognizing that a lot of this stuff that we think are software decisions can often be business decisions. And what do I mean by that, right? If we go back to this drawing, if we made zero trust a developer decision, then almost every site would have zero trust. It would be a much more secure world, probably, but that would make developers much more expensive, and it would make it harder for smaller companies to break into the software world, right? So this point here is a point of potential risk. This point's a point of potential risk. This is a point of potential risk, and this is a point of potential risk. And like, this is super simplified, right? You may have points of potential risk in the client itself, right? There's a whole bunch of places where potential risk can exist. This is just a super simplified diagram. As a good senior, your job is to help the business understand what the implications are of the risk at this level, right? So if we're talking about this level and we're talking about like the WAF, or an application gateway or things like that, we're talking about like DDoS type attacks. We're talking about CSRF or CXRF or XRF, right? Attacks, things like that. These are often handled by providers like Akamai, or maybe you're using like a Microsoft or a Google or an Amazon application gateway, something like that, right? That's going to help handle your load balancing. It's going to help handle what happens when services are down. It's going to help handle what happens if you get DDoS. It's going to help handle cross-site, stuff. There's a lot of stuff that happens here. This is probably not a good layer to compromise on, but again, that's a business decision, and helping to explain to your business what is the cost of a DDoS, what is the cost of cross-site scripting, what is the cost of things like that, right? Here, they've probably passed through this policy enforcement point at some sort. Now we're looking at tokens and things like that. And again, this is what is the cost of that? It's your job to help the business understand what is the cost. And again, here and here. And as we add these layers, it's not, it's not an incremental cost, right? It's often an exponential or a geometric or sometimes a logarithmic cost, right? And it's important for you to be able to communicate to your senior management that, hey, yeah, this cost may be this cost may be logarithmic, meaning we pay a whole bunch in the beginning, but as we add more layers, the cost really isn't that expensive, right? Or no, it's a linear cost. So as we add more and more layers, it just increases by the same amount. Or, oh no, it's exponential. So the number of layers we add increases the cost, right, dramatically with each new layer. And so, or, it's just a constant cost, right? We add the layer and then everything else we add doesn't cost more. But it's up to you to understand this and be able to communicate this to your leadership team, and understand what the implications of this are, and then help them understand if it's exponential, maybe we pick this layer and this layer, right? And that helps us keep the cost down. If it's logarithmic, then we just do everything because the initial cost is picked up by this layer and this layer, and then everything else is minimal cost, right? Or if it's cut, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff here where you can help the business understand what their risks are, how to mitigate those risks, and what the costs of those risks are. And then it comes down to business decisions. And that's part of the, a lot of people will be like, what do I need to learn to move from junior to senior to, more senior roles? One of the biggest pieces to understand is cost structure, the way your business works, and how to communicate with leaders about costs so that they can make decisions that they're comfortable with. And understanding things like this will help your career improve quite a bit. Anyway, we got a lot on this topic. Sorry about that. Let me grab a drink of water really quick. Oh. So we spent a lot of time talking about this topic, but I totally agree with what TBD Gamer is saying. Especially in today's world where, we have LLMs that can generate code, your value to the company is partly in code. Writing code hasn't gone away. Understanding code hasn't gone away. Understanding architecture and software and stuff like that hasn't gone away. What has started to happen is your value to the business has expanded. And by that, I mean being able to communicate with your leadership, being able to analyze and provide trade-off analysis and things like that. That's where your value really comes in. Long gone are the days of I'm a React developer and you're getting job offers left, right, and center. Long gone are the days of I work in this back-end language and you're getting job offers left, right, and center. Those still exist. And I don't think they'll ever go away. I still look at LLMs as a multiplier to you, right? If your skills are positive, the LLMs are going to multiply you in a positive way. If your skills are negative, or if they're weaker, the LLM are going to make your weaker skills that much weaker. And that's just the way I look at it. So it is in your best interest to have strong, positive skills. But you also need to start working on those soft skills, the communication skills, the cost value analysis skills, things like that. And confidence is a big one. Being able to go into a situation with a lot of unknowns and help provide stability and confidence, leadership, those kinds of things are what will really make you stand out from the rest, and they'll help you quite a bit. So anyway, big huge tangent, very much related to what we're talking about here, but I think it's important for us to understand, as we look through things like this, it's really, really easy for us to just go, oh yeah, there was a vulnerability here, and be like, okay, let me look at the workarounds. What's more important in today's day and age is, okay, what does this vulnerability mean? And, what are the ways that we can help handle it? So any developers on an unsupported version of Angular or unable to quickly update should consider using absolute URLs. So avoid using request.header for URL construction. Use trusted variables for your API path. Implement strict header validation middleware. Implement a middleware in your server TS to enforce numeric ports and validated host names, right? And so here, they're setting up this strict middleware in their server.ts, and they're validating the headers themselves. They're giving you a good workaround here, but really you should get to a supported version with the correct patches. So the open redirect via X-forwarded prefix in Angular SSR. So an open redirect vulnerability was identified in the internal URL processing logic. The logic normalizes URL segments by stripping leading slashes. However, it only removed a single leading slash. So this, again, is a mistake, right? So if we talk about this, basically what they're saying here is, let's say that our malicious site said, question mark redirect equals, slash admin, right? And this is not a header. The redirect header looks different, but this is a simple way to explain how this is working, right? What would happen is Angular would look at this and go, ha ha ha, sneaky you. You tried to redirect to slash admin. We're going to take the slash off here and just redirect you to admin. You're going to get a 404. But any good attacker is going to go, okay, I got a 404 there. What about if I do this? And now Angular's like, ah, you sneaky person, right? Remove the first slash, but the second slash stays there. You go to slash admin, right? This is kind of what they're talking about. Angular was only removing the first slash. The second slash was allowing you to go to slash admin or some other, right? And you bypassed an internal security piece using the X-forwarded prefix. So it's only removing the if Angular SSR application is deployed behind a proxy that accepts the X-forwarded prefix, right, header, and attacker. Oh, okay, so it's starting with 3 slashes. Causing a redirect to an attacker-controlled origin and could potentially poison any cache responses shared across multiple users. And this is important because if they get the proper redirect, they could get you to go, they could get you to send cookies to their domain. They could get you to do different things like that. So, and this is Angular SSR. So the client doesn't even have to be doing this. You may not even know that the client is doing this. This happens on the server. So the server could be tricked into sending information to an evil domain. And it could be tricked into getting information and giving it back to you, like poisoned caches, poisoned cookies, and things like that from an evil domain. So there's some important stuff to know there, right? So just not even accessing your admin, but even potentially poisoning your users, potentially stealing cookies, stealing credentials, stealing who knows what, right? So to fix this, you've got to update the Angular SSR, the latest version. Any developers on an unsupported version of Angular or unable to quickly update should consider sanitizing the X-forwarded prefix header. So you can grab the X-forwarded prefix, trim it, and if there is a prefix, what it's saying is that any beginning slash, so this regex is just saying any number of beginning slashes, right? One or more beginning slashes, it's going to replace with a single slash. So that's how they're that's how they're recommending you do it. So you would add stuff that would just replace extra slashes with a single slash, and then Angular is going to remove that single slash, and you're good to go. So yeah, those are the vulnerabilities. And if anybody has any questions about what we just brought up, feel free to just chime into chat or whatever. So the next piece was Angular just upgraded to 21.2. And these are the release notes for 20.2. Yeah, OLED. And so here's the thing. I'm not allowed to talk about who I work for because that might imply that I'm speaking on behalf of them, right? So one thing to recognize is that as Jason outside of work, I speak as Jason. I'm not speaking for the company I work for. I do, however, work in this stuff that we just talked about on a daily basis. And I'm a part of arbitration boards that talk about this stuff on a daily basis. So if you guys have any questions, or if you guys would love to see more about this, then I would be completely happy to talk about it with you. Ole also says, security is always on the side for the front end devs. And that is, it's a bit because of frameworks, right? And it's a bit because of the complexity of software. Like when I first started doing web development, you did everything. So, you usually had like Perl or C in your CGI bin directory. That was the piece that was processing posts and stuff. You wrote HTTP posts, right? You controlled everything from the back to the front. Then we started getting things like MooTools and Prototype and things like that that started to help with the front end side of things. So you started doing more in the back end. Then we started getting frameworks like ASP.NET, NetBeans, and just different things like that on the back end. PHP. I'm trying to remember back in the day the stuff that was used. PHP was a huge one. And PHP did server-side and template processing. And they started doing like, that's when you started getting into like cross-site scripting and stuff like that. And server-side injection and all sorts of crazy stuff. once we started adding databases, right, then you started getting SQL injection and just all sorts of crazy stuff. And so if you're like me and you basically started being a software engineer when the internet started, right? That's the crazy thing. I've been watching a lot of YouTube, and yesterday I went down the Gen X path, right? Because I am very much Gen X. I was born in 1977. So next Sunday, that means I'm turning what, 49, right? So that should give you guys an idea of how old I am. That tells you exactly how old I am, right? That puts me squarely in Gen X, right? Gen X ended it in 1980. And so one of the things they were talking about at Gen X is we watched the prosperity of the 80s. Like, you guys, if you guys didn't grow up in the 80s, you guys have no idea of how crazy the 80s were with like there I mean, Michael J. Fox made a name for himself by playing what was his name in Family Ties? I can't remember his name, but he was basically a capitalist kid living in this family. Hey, Minu, it's been a while. Thanks for showing up. But I mean, he was basically this capitalist, and he was always making fun of his family for not understanding capitalists and blah 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 blah. Right? That's the way the '80s was. It was just about excess and like ridiculously huge malls and all of this stuff, right? And then the '90s came along, and like that's when I was in high school. Was in the '90s. And kind of the nihilist worldview. That's when like grunge music and stuff came along, and that's when like the analog world of like maps and rotary phones and Blockbuster and that kind of stuff started to disappear, and we started to move into the digital world that we're in now. Where Netflix and iPhones and nobody here who I'm not going to say nobody here, but I will bet that there are very few people here who remember going into like a record store or a CD store or a tape store, right? And just browsing for hours on end, looking for that next CD to listen to or that next tape. Like for me, it was CDs because I was in high school and CDs were out. And my friends and I, we would go to the record store and we would just browse for hours looking through CDs, looking for something to listen to. And, only having like 12 songs on a disc that you would play on repeat was crazy. I remember CDs for films. Yeah, DVDs, right? Blockbuster was another big one, right? Like Friday night was a big deal. You'd go with your family to, before Blockbuster, you had the cassette tapes. And so you and your family, you would go to the video store. Everybody would pick something out. You would fight, and eventually, mom or dad would pick the movie that they really wanted to watch, and then we went home and we watched a movie as a family. It's not like that anymore, right? Like my daughters are watching whatever they want on their phones. We watch stuff on our TVs or computers, or our phones, and it's just a different world. That's kind of the Gen X thing, right? Is that Gen X, we span that gap. So we watch the old world die and we're watching the new world come into being. And we're the group that kind of has been around, and I'm not gonna paint us as being like superpowers or anything, right? We just were lucky enough that, my career started basically when the internet started, right? Like the internet started back in the 70s, but the World Wide Web really didn't pick up until like 95, 96. I graduated high school in 95. And so I started working in the very, very beginning of the web. So a lot of this stuff that, seems very, very common sense to me, most people haven't had to deal with it because, as people in my generation got more and more annoyed of having to do the same thing over and over again, we built into frameworks. This is how you do it. This is how you do it. This is right. And so, So people today, the the stuff that we worry about today is much different than the stuff we worried about in the 90s or early 2000s. And that's a good thing. But part of the problem is to really understand some of the security issues, you had to have lived through those security issues. And a lot of people don't live through those security issues until they're dragged into a war room going, what the hell happened? We just lost $50,000. How did this happen? Right? And suddenly it's a big deal. We had 2 video stores with tapes, and we had a Hollywood Video until 2015. That's awesome. I didn't realize Hollywood Video was still around in 2015. That's amazing. And tapes, like Be Kind Rewind. We actually bought this thing that we put next to the VCR because if you rewound your tapes to return them so you didn't get a fee, it would wear out your VCR. So you'd buy these rewinders that what you would do is when you finished watching the movie, you would pop the movie into the rewinder and then you could play a new movie. Is crazy, right? Thinking about having to actually rewind something. And it could take 2 minutes to rewind an entire movie, depending on how long it was. So yeah, yeah, we valued it more than, and I'm not, so here's the thing that, I'm a big fan of the Stoics, right? And one of the interesting things is that Marcus Aurelius, way back, in early Greece, one of the early emperors, he actually wasn't Greece. Marcus Aurelius was Rome. He was a Stoic in Rome, but the Stoics started in Greece, right? But one of the earlier emperors in Rome talked about this thing, right? That every generation thinks that the new generation is going to hell. Is basically the way he worded it, right? Like, we don't understand the new generation. And this is kind of like a lot of the hate that goes into like millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, is that the older generations don't understand the newer generations, and the newer generations are growing up in this world that is completely different than the world that I grew up in or that my parents grew up in, right? And so all of the stuff that I've learned for how to deal with the world doesn't make sense to my daughter, who's a Gen Alpha, who has had to deal with her friends screenshotting stuff and bullying her over, text messages or, my friend is mad at me, so they're just taking pictures of the wall and sending it to me. It's like, what the hell does that even mean, right? I didn't grow up with that. I don't know what that means. I don't know anything about it. And so it's not that any generation's better. It's that each generation has their own set of challenges and their own set of strengths. And I was watching, you guys really have me off topic today. And I probably pulled myself off topic by being a little bit under the weather. But I was watching Asmongold yesterday, and they were talking about IQ. And one of the interesting things that they were talking about, somebody said something like, you couldn't pass the test that an 8th grader took 50 years ago as a college graduate. I thought it was always like this. Fair enough. Mike, we had 2 videos. I don't know if it was truly a franchised one by that point. If it wasn't, it's not like someone could get them for it. That's fair, Michael. Yeah, Hollywood Video, they probably didn't have the legal department they had back in the 90s. But yeah, I'm always off topic, right? But it's totally true. I probably could not pass the tests that 8th graders were taking like 50, 60 years ago. That's probably 100% true. That doesn't mean that people 50 years ago were smarter than people today, right? What it does mean is that 50 years ago, the concerns were much different than the concerns of today. You could not get anybody 50 years ago to pass like a programming interview, right? It just wouldn't make sense to them. And those concerns wouldn't make any sense, right? You couldn't get somebody 20 years ago to tell you about the upsides and downsides of LLMs, right? LLMs are a very recent thing based on the transformer model. Before the transformer model became a thing, it was really like using like fake neurons and things like that. That's what AI was looking at, was how do we create fake neurons and things. And then the transformer model came about that really made LLMs possible. And that's, you know, what really brought AI to the masses. But 20 years ago, if you asked me questions about LLMs that I'm answering today, I couldn't have even given you a decent answer. Not sure I would pass interviews nowadays. Oh man, why'd you have to go and snipe me with this one, Ole? This one's a good one. I've been doing a lot of interviewing lately. And not me looking for a job, but I'm interviewing people who are looking for jobs. And I was having a discussion with one of the VPs, and the statement I made was, I'm never going to give somebody an interview that I couldn't pass myself. And that's an important piece, I think, that we need to realize, is that if the interviews that are being given today are not passable by you at your company, then your company's not giving people a fair shake. Because, you know, Ole, everybody here, I'm willing to bet, are good engineers, and they're doing good for their company. If you couldn't pass your current company's interviewing standards, then your company is doing something wrong. And that's an important piece to take away. Interviews, my belief is that interviews should be positive for both parties, right? And everybody should be given a fair shot at the job. If you don't pick somebody, they should go away from the interview having learned something and be better prepared for the next interview, is the way I look at it. If you do pick somebody, that's good for them, that's good for the company, but also the company, you need to be learning from every interview you're doing to provide better interviews for everybody else who comes along after. And so if you feel like you didn't give somebody a fair shake, then you should be fixing the process so that everybody else after gets a fair shake, right? And maybe even contacting them and being like, hey, maybe you deserve a second chance. Let's work it out. But a lot of companies out there right now are, there's the pendulum swing of, right, the workforce has the power versus the companies have the power. It used to be the workforce for a very long time, but now it's swinging back heavily to the companies, and the companies are being a bit unfair. And that's where I think, as people who are able to influence your company, and use your best judgment here, right? Don't go in and fight battles that you can't win. Don't put yourself at danger in this job market. Always protect your income, and your family and your family's income above everything else that some silly influencer like me says, right? Always, always, always protect yourself first. That's the most important thing you can do. But if you're in a position to help influence hiring and hiring practices, help your company understand that it needs to be a good experience for all involved. And let's be honest, no matter what you do with your hiring practices, at the end of the day, it's rolling a dice. And research shows time after time after time that quite often it's not the person with the best skills that's hired. it's often the person with the best charisma that's hired. Um, and so, helping your company resolve those biases to try and get away from charismatic hires and things like that is another big help. And then just realizing that no matter who you're going to hire, they're going to have blind spots, they're going to have weaknesses. Nobody is ever going to be 100% capable of passing an interview. Um, I bombed. So, back last year when I was looking for a job, um, I didn't put a lot of effort into my job interview with NX, and I completely bombed it, like horribly. Um, and then I turned around and I interviewed with my current company, and man, I was feeling terrible after that interview. They hit me pretty hard, I will admit. But for my position, I feel like the interview was fair. I was just like, man, I bombed that. So when I got the job offer, I was super happy. Yeah, for anybody out there who's stuck in a bad job or who's looking, I feel for you. I really, I'm hoping that the industry changes soon. Is the best way I can put that. But yeah, that's my thoughts on hiring, Ole. Let's get into the 21.2 release notes. So they added an outlet injector for the NG template outlet. Yeah, I interviewed with NX. So last December, December and January a year ago, I interviewed with NX. And there was a lot going on at that point in time. And I was not in the best place mentally. And so I didn't give it quite the attention that I should have, is the best way to put it. I just flat out failed. And so they had this interview question, and I'm not going to give away their interview question because they may use that interview question, but the interview question was one such that if you tried to brute force it, it became exponentially difficult. And, at 3 or 4 items, the calculation was so exponentially high that there was no way to do it. So, and a binary search was not the optimal solution. So it was recognizing that there was an optimal way to do it that made it better than a binary search by a little bit. But I messed up my boundary conditions. I don't know if it was LeetCode. Maybe it was a LeetCode question. But it was I really don't want to give it away, but it was you needed to recognize something about the numbers that you were being asked about, and then recognize something about the boundary conditions, and that allowed you to get away from binary or from brute force and binary searches, and allowed you to be a little bit smarter about how you search the space. And I messed up my boundary conditions, and I didn't write good enough tests to figure that out. Like I did okay at the rest of this stuff, but I didn't put the attention in that I needed to. And I was rightly rejected for that. But I guarantee that the people at NX that gave me that question could definitely figure out the answer and definitely figure out the boundary conditions and things like that. I will tell you that right now, I don't know how interviewing with NX is, but back then the NX interview was really good. The feedback they gave me was amazing. Like they gave me great feedback on why I failed my boundary conditions. They gave me great feedback on, what was going on and why we weren't moving on. And so I really appreciated that. I never had LeetCode questions on the interview. I actually am not a big believer in LeetCode unless you're doing engineering at the level of like Google or NX or stuff like that. I think the questions that you should be asking coding wise should reflect the work that the person is going to be doing at their current level. Um, so if you're, if you're a banking institution, you're probably not solving LeetCode questions every day. You're probably solving mathematics. You're probably solving input. You're probably solving stuff like that. Your stuff shouldn't go much above what you're going to be asked to do on a daily basis. But maybe for Google NX, they need it. Well, so it was kind of a LeetCode question, but it was very much geared towards NX. The other thing that I did, NX asked me to create a tool for the a tool to do some stuff with the NX. Basically, it was a plugin for NX, is what they were asking me to write. And I don't want to go into details there either, but they said it could be done in React or in Node. I chose to do it in Node. My Node was pretty rusty, and I made some mistakes on the way it compiled. And so when I sent it over, it worked for me, but it didn't work for them. And I didn't include in the README how I made it work. And I mean, there are just some things like that where my attention to detail wasn't at the level that it should have been for NX, and it was right for them, right? Like, if they're going to hire you, they want you to have that level of detail for their customers, right? Because when it comes down to it, most companies are selling reputation, and NX definitely sells reputation, especially when a lot of what they do is open source. Their reputation matters, and so they need people that have that attention to detail. And I didn't show that in my interview, and that was on me, right? And the feedback was definitely there. But yeah, for them, I mean, you think about the scale that NX works at, right? Like the repositories at some of these massive companies that are NX, and the number of files that they deal with, and the number of compares that they do per file. And you start to get into like large heap type situations where even binary searching is incredibly expensive. So you have to think about things in different ways. Yeah, it is, it can be, actually, it is fairly common to ask LeetCode type questions. For almost any vacancy, Oleg, not just Angular vacancy, which is weird, and it's something that's always bothered me. I would prefer, rather than asking LeetCode style questions to Angular developers, that you ask actual Angular questions, right? Like, one of my favorites for an Angular developer was create a dropdown with the 50 states, add a filter input and filter the input, and that's like an hour's worth of coding, but it gives me a whole bunch of ideas about how they think about state and all sorts of stuff like that, right? Which I care about way more than calculate the nth Fibonacci number based on blah 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 blah, right? So yeah. You'll alternate. Hey, Jason, could you also talk about the interview that you got, the job you have right now? How does it contrast with the NX interview from yours and their point of view? So my job interview is very different than the one I was. So the position I was interviewing with NX for was as a sales engineer. So my job was going to be traveling around and helping companies implement NX and stuff like that. The job that I have at my current company is very architectural related, and it's very much influence related. So there were actually 3 rounds of interviews with my current job. So the first round of interviews was the technical. Um, but because it's architecture and then because it was, I'm at a director level now, and um, it was less code and um, it was more a panel of people asking me questions about um, and what I thought about tech, how I thought about tech, how I would integrate tech. Um, they asked a bunch of questions about NX specifically, um, because the team that I work with right now is a platform team, and so we use NX quite a bit. We provide NX solutions. Um, I don't actually work with the NX part of the team that often now. Um, I'm more of a generalist across the organization, um, but they were asking me questions about AWS. They were asking me questions about NX. They were asking me questions about Angular. They were asking me my thoughts on trade-offs for technology X versus technology Y, that kind of stuff. My second round was a classical architectural interview. Hey, you alternate. Uh, I said hi already, but my so it was a classic architectural interview. And if you guys have ever been in a classic architectural interview, um, classic architectural interviews, basically the interview winds up with something like this. Um, so um, they asked me, what did they ask me? They asked me to design Instagram, I think. Um, and this is it, like, once you get into the higher levels, this is a classical question, right? And they do it on purpose. Um, so if you ever get into an interview and somebody goes, hey, design Instagram, what they're looking for is for you to recognize that there's no way you can design Instagram in an hour, right? So what you need to do when somebody says design Instagram or design Twitter or design, Google, the first thing you need to do is be like, okay, what part or what do we want to focus on? Um, so, and this is important with any interview that you go into. Um, if there's ambiguity, the ambiguity is on purpose. Um, and the reason the ambiguity is on purpose is because they want to see, one, how do you deal with stress? Two, what is your plan for dealing with ambiguity? And three, when you are in an ambiguous situation, can you help clarify ambiguity for everybody involved, right? Um, and so if you're ever asked an ambiguous question, they aren't looking for you to immediately start designing something or immediately start writing code. What they want you to do is ask questions and scope what you're doing to something manageable, right? And so I started asking questions, and we narrowed it down to, I can't even remember. I can't remember what we narrowed it down to, but basically we wound up drawing a diagram very similar to this, where we talked about, the client side of stuff. We talked about application gateways, we talked about APIs, we talked about databases, we talked about capabilities, we talked about record keepers. And the point of that interview, yes, exactly, Minu, they expect you to ask questions. And that's an important part, that as you get more senior, the amount of ambiguity you deal with goes up, 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 right? It's always there. Um, and so that's an important part of interviewing in general, is understanding that you're going to be dealing with ambiguity pretty regularly. As you get more senior in your positions. So being able to ask appropriate questions, because sometimes, somebody at your work will come to you and say, hey, we need to do X. One of the first questions you could ask is why. Obviously, you're not going to just ask why, but you're going to be like, what are we trying to solve with doing X? Okay, what does the customer really need, right? And to try to narrow it down to what we really need to do, because oftentimes when they say we need to do X, what they're asking you to do is a lot bigger than what the customer actually needs. An example of this was when I worked at the cybersecurity company. Leadership came to us and they said, hey, we need a way to export all the data to our clients. And we had clients that were ingesting like 10 million rows of data an hour. And so exporting 10 million rows of data to a client seemed silly. And I was really bothered by this because it was a big ask, stitching all this together from the various Elastic databases and being able to give them the data as we were ingesting, millions of rows seemed weird. And if I gave you like the last hours of data worth of data, and that's 10 million rows of data, what are you going to do with 10 million rows of data? And so my first question was, well, why? They said, well, the customer told us they need it for a report. I was like, but what report needs 10 million rows of data? And, and I asked enough uncomfortable questions that they allowed me to talk to the client. Turns out the client couldn't get our filters to filter down to something that they needed. And somebody at their company had put together some Excel filters that allowed them to get a report. We talked about the report they needed. The report they needed was way simpler than trying to export all these rows. It also allowed them to get much smaller amounts of data. So we weren't going to be transmitting 10 million rows worth of data. We were really only transmitting 5 to 10 rows of data, which was going to save us a ton of data in the end also. And they weren't going to have to download 10 million rows of data, break it up across Excel, run this filter. And, it took what was typically going to be like an 8-hour day for them and turn it into 5 minutes. That just asking those questions, right? The ambiguity of, hey, we need to do this. Well, why, right? So, hey, Marcus, welcome to the stream, man. It's good to have you here. That's the important, and that's one of the big skills, that you can learn as you're in your career, is being able to think about the entire system, right? Because a lot of engineers, when they get the ticket, let's export 10 million rows. A lot of engineers are like, okay, sure, we'll write an export that can export 10 million rows. But the amount of just processing required to do that was ridiculous. If instead you can look at the system as a whole and be like, well, why would anybody ever need 10 million rows? And then have the confidence to be able to ask that question. That's often the scariest part, especially if you're not a naturally gregarious person. If you're not naturally inclined to speak to others, that's a very scary part of becoming more senior, is being able to speak up in meetings, being able to approach people and ask questions. The other side of this, and this took me a long time to figure out, is there's the direct way to ask something, and then there's the diplomatic way to ask something. And they're important, right? People who are direct, I appreciate their directness, but often when I try to be direct, I come off as an asshole. Um, and I don't want to be that. And most people don't want to deal with that. So instead of being direct, I've had to learn to be more diplomatic. And in being diplomatic, sometimes it's recognizing that the question I want to ask is important. The context of where we're asking it is also important. And what do I mean by that? If somebody has spent a ton of time working on a demo, and I see a significant flaw in their demo, the best place for me to ask about that significant flaw is after the meeting where they do the demo, and in person and privately. The worst place for me to do that is in front of everybody and me to ruin, X number of hours that they spent preparing for the demo, X number of hours that they spent creating the demo, right? Like, that just makes them look bad. And it's not a good experience for them. It's really not a good experience for me. And so learning that diplomacy, learning that sometimes the best way to disagree with somebody is to agree with parts of what they're saying, and then help lead them to the parts that you disagree with through questioning. Some people aren't as open to Socratic method questioning like that. And so part of it, and this is a part that's been very difficult for me to learn also, is learning how to read others, and understanding others. That's why a lot of what I talk about now is like sociology, psychology, game theory, stuff like that. I learned that stuff for me, right? I pass it on because I hope that there are people out there like me, and I hope that they don't have to struggle through the things that I struggled with to get to where I am. But quite often, maintaining a relationship or even building a relationship, and allowing people to shine and then helping them recover behind the scenes is way better than being the person who's always right, or being the pit bull who tears people apart. You know, there are people like that. You guys have worked with them, and sometimes they do their job is necessary, but that's not the position that works for me. And I don't know. It's taken me a long time to figure out what does work for me. Anyway, the third round of interviewing, but specifically the stuff that we were just talking about now. So they wanted to see how I build influence. They wanted to see, how I communicate with senior leadership. They wanted to see if I had communicated with senior leadership. Oh, sorry about that again. They also wanted to see how I lead others, and then how I resolve conflicts. All of that stuff was important for the position that I'm in now. So how did they differ? My current position is a bit more of a leadership role, and so it was more leadership focused. The position at NX was very much engineering and technical, so it was very technical focused. Hopefully that answered your question, Johalternit. Yeah. My throat is definitely starting to tickle a bit now. We'll see if we can make it through this last little bit. It's been a lot less technical today, but I enjoy these kinds of streams. And you guys let me know how you feel about them too. Because the way I look at it, Angular is a framework. Angular will eventually disappear, right? So if all I ever do is teach you guys Angular, I've taught you guys a skill that will become obsolete. If, on the other hand, I look at Angular as a vehicle for us to have discussions about bigger topics, um, then we can talk about things in a shared framework, right? We can help teach people Angular, which is important. And I'm not going to say it's not important. But at the same time, we can use that vehicle as a way to springboard into discussions like today, like interviewing, or even our discussion on security, right? Right, like a discussion like this where we talk about the importance of security, we talk about trade-offs, we talk about how you can help communicate these trade-offs to your leadership. I view this as more important than the Angular skills. I think the Angular skills are very important, but I think that there are skills that will help you become leaders in the community. There are skills that will help you become leaders in your job. There are skills, that may help you mentor others that hopefully I can pass on. And that's where I view my value. I don't think that I'm the most amazing Angular developer out there, but I do think that I've got plenty of years of experience that I can pass on. To me, non-technical is better. Technical I can learn by myself anytime, but discussing non-technical stuff has many layers of advantages. Not advantage, benefit. I agree with both. Non-technical stuff has many layers of advantages and many layers of benefits, right? Being able to communicate, being able to reason about things at a higher level gives you an advantage when you're going into difficult situations. I don't know how many of you guys have ever been involved with a, with a high security finding. Like one of the very first ones I was ever involved with, I worked for a company called BRG. It was the Boston Research Group is who they were. Actually, no, this was after BRG. This was Western Watts. Western Watts and BRG were both similar companies. And what they did is they call people on the phone and conduct telephone interviews. At Western Watts, I started programming interviews. I made a mistake that cost the company $80,000. Which was more than double my salary at the time. And I was sick. Like it made me sick because I was sure I was losing my job. And if I lost my job, then how would I pay my rent? And how would I do this? And how would I do that? Right. It was a big deal. I learned something though when I went into the meeting about where we lost the money, right? The discussion wasn't, Jason, you suck. Jason, you cost us money. Jason, you did this. Jason, you did that. Right? That wasn't the discussion. The discussion was, how did this happen? What caused it? How can we avoid it in the future? What will we implement to help prevent this from happening in the future? And I walked out of that meeting feeling amazing, right? It's the same thing when you get into high pressure situations. If you walk into a high pressure meeting in a, the website's down, how do we get the website back up type meeting? If you can come in and you can analyze the problem at a high level and help the company get the website back up in a minimum amount of time, and then come back and help do, a risk assessment and some fact finding and what went wrong, how do we avoid it type stuff, then you're a much better asset for the company, right? Because you're able to think on those layers than somebody who gets in there and panics and focuses. It's quite often that people get hyper focused on an error message or something like that, and they're unable to get out of that focus and look at the system as a whole. And there was I worked for a company called KSL Cars. Um, and at KSL Cars, we introduced two load balancers to handle traffic. What we didn't know enough back then. This was back in the early 2000s. As a company, we didn't know enough to know that when we introduced the load balancers, the way we did it was not good. So, because of the way we did sessions and the way we did the load balancers, the session only stayed on the web server that you initially connected to. And so we had 3 web servers, and then we had a load balancer. And let's draw this out because this is a fascinating thing in it. So the way it worked is we had 3 web servers. And then we had a load balancer. Right? And then we had you as a client. And this is web server 1. This is web server 2. And this is web server 3. And this is our load balancer here. And so let's say you were a client, right? And you made a request. When we introduced the load balancer, your request went to the load balancer. Our load balancer was set up so that our sessions weren't sticky. It was set up random. So just for the sake of, this is where we were, let's say you went to web server 1. Right, there was a 1 in 3 chance that you were sent to web server 1. This is where your session is stored, right? This is your login session, right? So let's say you make another request. Well, the second request has a 1 in 3 chance of hitting the web server where your login session happens. After the second request, we were losing. So by the second request, only 33% of users could see second search page, right? This is where it showed up the most. Because most people just log in again if they were doing something else. But, they're searching for cars. Only 33% of users could see the second search page. The third page, well, now it's 1 in 9, right? Which winds up being, I think it's like 11.1%. Somewhere in that area, if I'm doing the math in my head, right? By the fourth page, actually, this is wrong. This is only 33% of users could see the first page of the search results. The second page could only be seen by 1 in 9, and the third page, you had a 1 in 27 chance of seeing your search results by the third page, right? Because the law of probability, right? You've got a 1 in 3 chance, a 1 in 3 chance, and a 1 in 3 chance. That's 1 in 27. This was bad enough that only 33% of users could see their search. Because if you came in, right, let's say you were looking for your search results, and your login session was on web server 1, and you hit this, and then you got redirected to web server 3. Well, the session isn't here. So let's say you log in, you're like, oh, something weird happened. So second login session, right? And so now you don't get your search result. Angular has been my springboard into the tech space. Unfortunately, I don't do as much Angular today, but I don't regret going deep in it for a second. Yeah, Marcus, if you guys ever get a chance to talk to Marcus, you should take advantage of it. Marcus is an amazing person, and I am very lucky to have got to meet Marcus and just hang out with Marcus. And his tech career is definitely taking him in a different direction, away from the Angular community. But Marcus is very, very strong technically, and he has a lot of the skills that we're talking about here. But yeah. And something's going on with here. Okay, I'm missing something that Michael and Ole were talking about, but but yeah, this showed up in weird ways because let's say you logged in here, you did a search here, and then it sent you back to the first session. Well, now your searches would be weird and be off, and then right, so you'd be ping-ponging between two servers where you're logged in and a third server where you're not logged in, and then you could get 3 login sessions, which would just make a mess. And the way the logs looked were really, really weird. And we had somebody hyper-focused on just, the web servers are broken, look at the errors in the web servers and blah, blah, blah. What really needed to happen is we just turned on sticky sessions in the load balancer. And so while we had somebody very, very loud talking about we need to, all this other stuff, which they weren't wrong, the stuff that they were suggesting wasn't wrong, but the easier fix was to just turn on sticky sessions. And so with sticky sessions, once you logged into the first session, the load balancer had added something to your cookies that told it, hey, this always goes to web server 1, blue always goes to web server 3, and that fixed everything. Within 15 minutes of turning on sticky sessions and rebooting the load balancer so that everybody got the sessions that they needed, we were back up and running. And then we could talk about the bigger fixes, right? Because eventually we wanted to go to round robin or random, and we wanted to add session management in the back. But if we had taken the time to do session management, our site would have had problems for days, whereas we could fix it in 15 minutes. If you have LeetCode questions for front-end developers at your company, yeah. Almost every American company asks LeetCode questions, Ole. It's the American way. We'll put it that way, right? I don't know. I was about to make a joke that, LeetCode questions, LeetCode questions are as American as apple pie. You just get asked LeetCode questions if you're going into a coding interview. I disagree with LeetCode questions. I think if you're a front-end dev, you should be asked questions about front-end, stuff about CSS. Center a div is a good front-end question. One question I was asked, they gave me some code and they asked me to find the bug in the code. That was a front-end Angular template. I actually found 3 bugs in their code, 2 of which that they were unaware of, and the one that they were looking for. that was an opportunity for me to shine, right? Um, and that was something that I would be doing on a day-to-day basis. Me finding all the prime numbers between 1 and 1,000, using some sort of sieve of Eratosthenes or some sort of Euler function or something like that isn't something that I do on a daily basis, right? Could I do it? Absolutely. Will I do it? Why? Right? Um, let's be honest. Like if you're only looking for prime numbers between 1 and 1,000, you're much better off pre-computing them, having them cached, and just using that filter, right? It doesn't make sense for you to calculate a prime number every time between 1 and 1,000 because there aren't that many. And if you pre-compute them, then you save a whole bunch of computational power of using sieves and all of that other stuff. So, you'll alternate. As you progress in your career, you'll notice a lot of people don't know what they're doing and rely on dogma and convention to appear knowledgeable. That often translates on some people doing the same thing someone else is doing, and that's how companies that do WordPress sites end up asking LeetCode questions. That is that is so profound, Yo alternate, that I love it. It's so profound in so many ways. Um, it's it's the same way I look at being an adult. Um, Most of the time as an adult, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing, right? Um, Most of the time, I'm faking it. Um, I run into so many things like, the battery in my car goes bad. What do I do? I don't know. I've never run into this before, right? I get a flat on the side of the road. What do I do? I don't know. I've never, right? Like my sprinkler system in my house breaks. My basement floods. Right? There's just so much that you don't know how to do. Um, it's the same way professionally. Um, but in You'll alternate, this could be very much American biased. I will say that. Um, you're going to run into things all the time in your job, that you just don't know what to do. I think the biggest issue that we have, um, as Americans is, we don't allow ourselves to fail. And maybe other cultures are the same way, but I think it's hyper. It's a hyper focus in Americans of being perfect, right? You have to give the perfect answer. You have to give the perfect whatever. Um, and because of that, you get stuck in these situations where people are just spouting nonsense. Or how do we hire people? I don't know. Give them a LeetCode question, right? Um, because that's what Google does. And Google hires good people, and we need to hire good people. Well, you probably don't need Google engineers to build WordPress sites, to your point, you alternate, right? I think so. Slimming Planet. First of all, welcome to the stream, Slimming Planet. I appreciate you being here. Hi, guys. I think in the US, much less front end Angular job than in Europe. For 6 months, I didn't get even one Angular front end interview, except Indian big tech, but a lot of full stack. And that's a good point. Also, Angular is giving way to React a lot in the US. Even a lot of the big bastions of Angular, have started going React more. So companies that I used to talk to about Angular a lot are now talking about React. And I think part of that is in the US, we focus on profit a lot. And when you look at the LLMs do a lot better with React than they do with Angular. And so companies that are heavily invested in AI and LLMs are like, well, we could keep doing Angular, or we could let our LLMs start writing React and make our developers change, right? So I agree with that slimming point that the USA is showing a lot fewer front end Angular jobs, and they're disappearing faster and faster. Um, I haven't looked at stats since I was last looking for a job, um, but companies like or countries like France has a lot more Angular. I think Angular is might even be number one in France. Um, there are a couple other countries like that. Austria, I think, has a huge Angular presence. I think largely due to the fact that there are some amazing Austrian Angular contributors out there, right? You've got like Manfred and Rainer and Michael Hadke and a couple of other Austrian, you know, stuff like that. But yeah, one of my biggest issues with this aversion to failure is that you are incentivized to cover your flaws, and that makes it a lot harder to improve. Basically, improvement got to happen in secret. I, yes, before I got pulled off, that is one of the biggest problems I have with American tech. And you hit it right on the nose. And I don't know about like European tech as much, but the American tech is very much this way. Where when you go into a meeting and you speak up, you better be 100% correct, um, or you better sound like you're 100% correct because you cannot make mistakes, right? And if you make mistakes, it's a shameful thing. People aren't allowed to fail, and I'm not. Most companies won't say it's like that, right? It's more of like an unspoken cultural thing, and I don't know where it came from, because everybody knows that failure is a part of learning. And even like this discussion here, right? This was a massive failure on the part of the company I was working for, KSL Cars at the time. Um, Massive failure. Why was it a massive failure? Because we didn't understand we didn't understand load balancers, we didn't understand login sessions at the time, right? And so we caused pain for our users because we didn't understand this piece. Um, you know, what did that lead us to? Well, first of all, we learned about the difference between sticky sessions, random sessions, and round robin. Which we had no idea when we set up the load balancer. We just thought a random will be best because it's going to distribute best, right? So we learned a lot more about load balancers. The next thing we learned is we learned about sessions, and then we learned about you can add stuff on the back, right, to do session replication, right? Which then allows these web servers to so then we can go random, and then the session can be replicated across the web servers. And there are different ways of achieving this, right? And there are lazy ways, there are opportunistic ways, there are eager ways, there are a whole bunch of ways to do this kind of stuff. Most front-end devs are probably not exposed to this anymore because a lot of this stuff is solved by Amazon and cloud providers and things like that, and their load balancers understand this already. Way back in the day, we had to learn this stuff because if you didn't hit web server 1, your responses weren't coming from the right place, and so you weren't getting the pages that you needed and stuff like that. This was a big mistake. Like, it caused significant problems with customers. It caused headaches in our call centers. It caused all sorts of problems. This was a huge opportunity for our company to learn about something we didn't know. In a modern era, I'm not sure that this learning would have been as possible. There were always less Angular jobs, but there were less Angular devs, and that's fair too, right? I will tell you that a lot of the big React devs that I know are much more interested um, in Angular because of changes that have been made in React recently and changes that have been made in Nest recently have made Angular more palatable to React devs. And the lines are becoming more and more blurred. Um, I think full stack is nice to understand nowadays. I think so. There are a couple of ways that people talk about developers, right? There's the classic T-shaped skills developers, right? And the idea of T-shaped skills um, is that you should be broad, but you should have one skill that's really, really deep, right? Like this could be your Angular skill. Maybe this is like CSS. It's and your HTML skills are deeper, but maybe your back end skills aren't as deep, right? This is the idea of a T-shaped skill. The latest one that they're talking about is this notion of V-shaped skills, right? So the notion of V-shaped skills is this is where your Angular knowledge should be the deepest, right? And then maybe your CSS and web knowledge is over here, and some of your full stack knowledge is less over here. But so and maybe your security knowledge or your knowledge of Amazon or the various cloud providers isn't as deep, but you should have knowledge of a broad array of areas where you go very deep into one, and then your supporting skills are a little bit less deep. This is the more common one that they talk about now than the T-shape, because often T-shape, like if you draw this out, this looks a little V-shaped anyway, right? Um, so I agree with you. It is important. So I think as a full stack dev, you should understand some things about APIs. You should understand some things about backend. You should understand some things about cloud hosting. You should understand some things about CI/CD. You should understand, right? But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that could be front end related that fits into this lower part of the V. Things like, how do I debug frames per second? How do I look at bundle sizes, right? Like, maybe these hang off the shallower end of the V, and you're understanding the framework's the deeper piece. But all of these skills are much more important, right? If you're getting bad frame rates, if you're getting bad bundle sizes, if you're getting things like that, you should be able to troubleshoot those as you get more and more experienced as an Angular engineer, or even as a front end engineer. And then maybe this next tier here is your back end understanding, and then maybe you've got your your DevOps understanding, and then maybe you've got other understanding here, right? I look at it kind of as a pyramid where the most important pieces of your knowledge go deeper into the valley, and I guess it's not a pyramid, right? It's inverted. But then you've got other supporting pieces of knowledge that aren't as deep, and as it gets further and further away from what you know and specialize in, you get less and less deep knowledge. But you should have good knowledge across the entire spectrum. There are other pieces of this. Like, this is your practical knowledge, is the way I would put this, right? This is your practical knowledge. Man, drawing this with a trackball is fun. I could have probably just typed it out, but there you go. You guys can see how horrible my handwriting is. That's probably pretty close to the way it is anyway. So this is your practical knowledge, is what I would say here. There's theoretical knowledge also. And I think theoretical knowledge is what supports a lot of your practical. And I think theoretical knowledge isn't going to be V-shaped. Theoretical knowledge is things like proxies, right? Things like interfaces, things like algorithms, things like big O, things like optimization. There's a whole bunch of supporting knowledge, right? And we could probably list tons and tons and tons of stuff. This gets even bigger as we start adding in LLMs, right? So as we start talking about tokenization, as we start talking about perplexity and things like that, right? This theoretical knowledge that you can't really apply practically, but makes your practical knowledge better. So like the notion of proxies, right? Instead of using your date functions or whatever date thing you're using, you provide a proxy around it, and provide a better provide one thing that you can swap out the concrete implementation at a later date and only change one place, but your code remains largely the same. Ideas like that, domain-driven design, all of these theoretical stuff that makes you better at the practical, but it's not really V-shaped. This stuff just enhances your ability to go deeper in all of these areas, is the way I would look at it. I think I'm going to have to end. My throat is not happy. I appreciate you guys being here. I really appreciate all the comments. Next week, we will get back into the code. I really want to finish up this move to Signal Store. That I think is the most interesting thing for me right now. How do we take an existing implementation with custom components and turn it into a better Signal Store implementation? So we'll get that finished up. And then the next thing I want to do is actually not Angular related, but there's a library out there that allows us to create MCPs using TypeScript. I've never created an MCP, so I want to learn how to create an MCP with you guys on stream. So we'll figure out how to create our own MCPs, because as it stands, the biggest skills we can learn right now are AI related, and I want to be able to help you guys learn AI related skills. And from there, I'm not sure where we'll go, but those are my two big ones right now. I've got a whole bunch of other ones in my list of things to do. They keep getting shuffled around. I know we've talked about writing a game and stuff like that. I would love to do that again. But yeah, that's kind of where we are. Thanks again for being here. We will see you guys next time, next week, and have a great weekend. And